there.
Yeah, I'll just put this on slide. Is it already on the slideshow? Okay.
Yeah, it's moving. Go ahead.
Good. Thank you. Apologies for that technical problem. So, well, it's slightly ironic that I'm actually here in Ljubljana and we had more technical problems than any other time when I was giving a presentation from much further away. Anyway, so what I was trying to say was that traditionally or typically parking has been seen as a very operational kind of thing related to where to put your car, and municipalities have often seen it as a thing about managing where people can put their car, managing who has access to the spaces, managing how much is charged, if anything, managing how many spaces are available, and so on. But it's really, really important, and this is the whole point of the Park for Some project, to think about parking as something more than that, as a key measure to achieve SUMP objectives. And that's what the cities in Park for Some have been thinking about. There is absolutely no doubt that parking has a big influence on the way people travel. So if one of your SUMP objectives is to achieve other objectives by reducing the number of car trips and the proportion of people driving, then parking management is a very powerful way to do that. Boosting the local economy. There is a relationship between parking and the local economy. It's not a straightforward relationship by any means. We could do a whole presentation on that. But if boosting the local economy is one of your SUMP objectives, and it usually is, then parking has a role to play in that. Cutting congestion. People spend a lot of time in traffic looking for parking places. So at a micro scale, you get congestion that's the result of parking search. But at a more macro scale, if you manage the parking supply, then you can reduce traffic and therefore reduce congestion. Improving safety. If you want to do that, then sometimes using parking as a traffic calming measure, or alternatively removing parking that's causing really big safety problems, is a way to help achieve your safety objectives. And improving accessibility, both at the micro level, so making the pedestrian environment more accessible, but also at the macro level. The way that we manage parking has a big impact on how people can access the things that they need. So I hope you can see that parking is a lot more about just where to put your car or managing where people can put their cars. And if we look at those cities that have really changed the way that people travel, that have cut congestion, that have improved accessibility, but that have reduced car use, then there is no getting away from the fact that they have used parking management in a strategic way to help to achieve that. Not the only thing, but it's been part of all those cities' actions. Sorry, improving health as well. Now there are parking management tools, and I've divided these into two categories. There's a more operational parking management tool, and these are the ones that we're maybe more familiar with. So, setting time limits, making sure that residents have priority access to parking on the street, charging, obviously, prohibitions, using little bits of infrastructure like bollards at a micro scale to stop obstructive parking. So, as I say, those are the kind of parking management measures that we might be more familiar with. And if we just take the view of parking as parking being about where I'm going to park a car, then these are obviously the tools that local authorities and municipalities have traditionally used when they get to the stage of going, oh, well, there are certain areas where demand is exceeding supply for parking. We're going to have to do something about it. These are some of the things that they will traditionally do. And these are things that have an impact also on the way that people travel. There's no getting away from that. I mean, if you charge fees and pricing where there were no fees and pricing before, some people will choose not to travel by car. If you set time limits on parking, then you're probably going to free up a bit of parking so that people don't have to search so long for parking, so you'll cut congestion at a micro level. So it's not to say that these things don't help meet some objectives, but they're the things that have more traditionally been seen as kind of operational. But then there are other things as well that are a bit more strategic and maybe could come from the sump and obviously also support the achievement of some objectives. So changing parking space into other space or other uses of that space. Reducing or limiting the supply of parking, not overnight, but gradually and consistently. Limiting the parking built with new development so that there isn't such a huge amount built with new development, and taxing off-street parking. But currently the law only permits that in Britain and Australia, so that's a bit of a restricted option. But I think you can see that the top group of things here on this slide are definitely about managing the parking space and where somebody can park. The ones in the bottom category are about effectively influencing the total amount of parking that's available. And we have to say, I would say, I've been saying for a long time, and more people are agreeing, that parking management is a unique SUMP measure because it's very effective, but it's relatively acceptable. So what this slightly complicated graph is trying to show is that if you want to save fuel from transport, so effectively if you want to reduce car use, there are measures that are very effective, and those measures are over on the left-hand side of the graph. There's road pricing, which is the pink line, and there's increasing fuel prices, which is the yellow line, topical. But the level of acceptability of those measures is pretty low. Parking pricing here, which is an element of parking management, is in the middle. So it's quite effective, and it's also relatively accepted. And then these other measures here are the measures to do with making alternatives better. So bus priority measures and pedestrian and bicycle lanes and so on. And they're things that are an important part of an SUMP, but they have less direct impact on their own on car use, fuel consumption, and so on. So really, if you want to have a measure or to use a measure that's both relatively acceptable because people know about it, it's no surprise, the idea of parking management, whereas the idea of road pricing is a big surprise to a lot of people. If you want something that's relatively effective and relatively acceptable, then parking management is a pretty unique measure. And really, it's only one of two or three measures that municipalities can use if you want to restrain or reduce the amount of traffic in your towns. And another option would be what's called traffic circulation plans. I think there's been one other webinar about those, used in Belgium in particular, making it difficult to drive or use many streets as through streets. Parking management is the main traffic restraint measure that is available. So moving on then to this ParkPAD thing, that's part of Park for Sump. It's a product or output from Park for Sump and something we've been doing with all the cities in Park for Sump. It's a tool for the city to review its policies, basically its parking policies and its parking measures, and try to improve them, achieve consensus on what needs to be improved, and then achieve consensus on what actions need to be taken to address the areas that aren't very well developed at the moment. So one area might be the relationship between parking and public space or use of space for other uses, and that's something that gets discussed in a ParkPAD audit. And then an action plan might be, well, we're going to set a number of parking spaces per year that we plan to change over to other uses. So ParkPAD functions effectively or essentially with the help of an evaluation group. And the evaluation group is really, really important because it's not just people from the city administration. The evaluation group includes politicians. So just the other day, I was with colleagues from UIRS. We were doing a ParkPAD audit in Banja Luka in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we had a political representative along with us in the meeting the whole time. Officials, obviously people who work on parking, public parking companies if they exist, private parking operators if they exist, and then user groups like cycling lobby groups, NGOs to do with disabilities, chambers of commerce, and so on. So the group is brought together physically, COVID permitting, to discuss parking in the city, and that's quite an unusual kind of setup, really. And the evaluation group is led or managed by an auditor, sometimes two auditors, who are the people who know their way around ParkPAD and have some expertise in parking, but their job is mainly to manage the discussions of this evaluation group. So it's something, I have to say, in general, in our work, we don't have much opportunity to step back and review what we've been doing in a particular area of our work over the last 2 years or 3 years, and then think, how are we going to improve what we're doing? How do we need to move forward? What have we done well? What have we done not so well? And so ParkPAD, it plays that function in relation to parking in a city, in a municipality. And it also sometimes can be the first opportunity for user groups to get together with the administration and talk about parking in a kind of interactive way. So that graphic just shows the people who make up, the groups of people who make up the audit group. And where it says evaluator, the reason for that is that prior to the meeting of the audit group, each of these people who's invited along within each of these groups, they have the role of evaluator, and they get to evaluate using a questionnaire the current status of parking policy and parking measures in the city using 14 questions, and they're scored on a 5-point scale. And basically the idea is that that if you score a 0, then the city's doing very, very little or nothing in that area. And if you score a 4, it's up there with the best. It's really thinking about each of these parking issues in a very systematic way, in a way that relates to the SUMP, in a strategic way, and in an advanced way. And then there are obviously steps in between. And each evaluator prior to the meeting fills in the questionnaire. And so you get a score from each evaluator, and you get an average score for each question and an understanding of how much disagreement there is between the different evaluators about the different questions or the different issues in parking. So topics covered in the questionnaire are general parking policy, bike parking policy, the way the administration informs and consults about parking policy, different types of enforcement, park and ride, loading and unloading. So actually some of the questions are very strategic, some of the questions are quite operational. And once that's been filled in, you hold a meeting, consensus meeting, and basically the consensus meeting, there's a picture of a meeting. I think that is a consensus meeting. Those people look like they're en route to achieving consensus. Yeah, it discusses where there's disagreements about the answers to the questions, where, you know, maybe the NGO for disability has said, oh, enforcement is terrible, and we can't walk along the pavement, and it's really, really bad. And then somebody from the city administration or the city parking company has said, no, it's excellent, we do a really good job. And then they have a debate about that. So that enables both sides to hear from each other, hopefully, using with the skills of the facilitator, the auditor. You can reach a consensus about the score for each question. But sometimes it's not possible to reach a consensus. But in most of the audits that I've done, a consensus is generally reached. And this helps to establish the priority areas for action on parking in future, because obviously those areas that have scored low, then all other things being equal, you would expect that those were areas where the city might want to work on in future. But not always, because there is a question, for example, about guiding drivers to on-street parking spaces, and many cities score low on that because they don't do very much, but they may also decide they don't actually want to do any more than they're currently doing. So this meeting, this consensus meeting, has this purpose of discussing the questions, discussing why the scores are as they are, why there might be a lot of disagreement, and then trying to reach agreement, and then trying also to establish the priority areas for further work. And that means that also priorities can cover things that are not in the questionnaire. So the meeting may say, hey, well, there's this issue that's not in the questionnaire. We need also to do something about that. You can have a site visit to look at parking, which is not everybody's cup of tea, but clearly if you're having a meeting about parking, probably people will want to go and have a look. And this is particularly helpful for the auditor, who may not be from, or is usually not from, the city in question. So they get an understanding, a practical understanding, an impression of parking in the city, how much there is, what problems exist, what good things there are, so on. And then meeting 2, based on meeting 1 and the priority areas, it establishes action plans for the areas that were seen as priorities from meeting 1. So, for example, enforcement of some description is usually coming up as a priority for further action. Many of the cities that I've worked with on ParkPADs, they have the situation where their central area has a controlled parking zone, and enforcement is relatively good, but that's because it's the city that does the enforcement in those areas. Outside those areas, there's a reliance on the police, who are less keen on enforcement because it's not really part of, crime scene of the crime CSI for image. Is the parking enforcement doesn't really fit in, so they have other priorities, as they say. So these cities often try to think about ways in which they can improve enforcement in their less central areas. In this case, this hypothetical action plan, the decision was to make enforcement more efficient and effective by decriminalising, handing over the task to a private organisation rather than the public organisation doing it. And then there's a set of basic steps, and project management plan in very, very outline. And Mr. Jones apparently will be the responsible person in this hypothetical city. As I said, I've been involved in a number of actual audits. What are the benefits of doing it? It helps to boost the profile of parking management as something that can help to achieve SUMP objectives. I think there's no doubt that the meeting we had in Banja Luka the other day really helped to boost the profile of parking management as an issue that the city should be doing more on. As I said before, it brings together the people who, they're stakeholders in parking, which is also really important. It allows you to agree on what the city's done well, and that can be helpful too, to give itself a pat on the back, but also to say what is not so good and set the priorities for improvement. And there's some of the things that one of the cities I helped, the less advanced cities, the city that hadn't done so much in parking management already, and they prioritized these areas like the public space issue, the enforcement issue, involvement of people in parking policy development, and so on. They were areas for improvement. And the advanced city actually identified many of the other things, many of the same things as well, but also something that wasn't on the questionnaire, which was about how you distribute and how many residents parking permits you should give out. So these audits, I think, do have a real benefit for the cities. And certainly if your city is thinking about ways in which parking should become more part of its SUMP, then this is a really, really useful way to go. By the way, Mate, I don't have a clock in front of me, so could you tell me how I'm doing for time?
Yeah, we still, we have scheduled time off at 11, so we still have time, 20 minutes, even for the discussion. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, I've got a few more slides. All right. So all of the cities in Park for Some, somewhere I've got one of those obligatory maps, which shows you all the partners, where they are. All the partners in Park for Some have carried out ParkPAD audits, and those ParkPAD audits have helped to inform the actions that they then implemented in the project. Okay. So I'll just go through some of those and also draw your attention to one or two of the other outputs from the project that I think are particularly useful. There's the obligatory map. Good. So you can see we have a pretty broad spread of cities in different countries across Europe, from the north to the south and the east to the west. There is a partner in the UK, but no city in the UK. And we've got some cities that were just starting out in parking management, so like Škoda in Albania. And we've got other cities that are real leaders or have been using parking management for a long time and have a lot of expertise, like Freiburg and Rotterdam and Trondheim. And we've also got some cities that do some unusual things. So Umeå up there in Sweden, up there in northern Sweden, they have very innovative approach to parking in new buildings, for example. So really interesting range of cities, but all of them have done a ParkPAD audit. And I'll just run through some of the things that have come out and that they've done as a result of this. So many of the cities involved, they were either already considering or as a result of the ParkPAD audit have decided to regularly increase their controlled parking zone. And so this is a map of Gdansk in Poland. And these are new areas of its controlled parking zone on the right-hand side. So this represented a very significant expansion of its controlled parking zone, because prior to the project, then basically, I can show my mouse, this area around here is controlled. And a couple of areas here are controlled, but all the other yellow areas, these are all new areas. So very significant expansion of the zone. The data over here actually come from Krakow and the expansion of a new parking zone in on-street controlled parking zone in Krakow, where you can see that this does obviously help to achieve an SUMP objective, because in the before situation, 33% of trips in the area were made by public transport, which went up to 44% in the after situation. The car use fell. So the regular review of the size of the controlled parking zone, not only as a way of dealing with parking problems in those zones, but also as a way of influencing the way that people travel in the city. That's come out. The ParkPADs, that's come out of the project. Changing parking spaces to other uses. Here's an example from Zadar. This is a measure that's been implemented during the lifetime of the project. This doesn't look like the same place, but actually it is, because if you look at the building, the pink building on the left, you'll see it is the same building. And this is on the city walls of Zadar. I'm sure many of you have been to Zadar. There's the port there on the east side of the city peninsula. And this is the before situation, where up on the city walls was used as a car park for 500 cars. Not all visible in this picture. And now these 500 cars, they no longer have access to this space, and the space has been turned into a hugely popular city park. And here it is on the right-hand side. So many of the cities within Park for Some have undertaken this kind of change of parking space to public space within the lifetime of the project, where this 500 spaces in Zadar was really quite a major shift. Reducing parking supply. It's within the Park for Some project. I'm not entirely sure if any of our partners have made a commitment to over time reducing parking supply. But there are other cities which have. So, for example, Copenhagen and Paris over time removing on-street parking spaces, but not replacing them with off-street parking spaces, and in a systematic and long-term way. Another way of reducing parking supply, parking standards for new development. Freiburg in Germany is a city that is well known for sustainable transport, but one of the issues they grappled with over time is that at the national or Baden-Württemberg level, they have some difficulty in limiting parking standards, but they've, as a result of this project, introduced more flexible parking standards and more maximum parking standards, which is what Freiburg want, because they want to use parking standards to reduce parking supply over time. But a city I'm also familiar with over many years, Oxford in Great Britain, not a project partner, but a great example of how they used maximum parking standards since 1973, actually, to reduce the parking in new buildings. So whenever, new developments, but new developments without very much or any parking, especially in the central area. So the number of employees, the number of people living in the central area, hugely grown over those years since 1973, but parking supply not increased with the number of people, and therefore obviously that's been fundamental to cutting car use in the city centre. Most people are travelling to the city centre of Oxford by other means of transport. And the Park for Some project has produced an excellent publication available in various languages about parking standards and how to use them to steer mobility planning and make parking in buildings more sustainable. So that covers it covers parking for vehicles, it covers parking for electric vehicles, and it covers parking for bikes. There's an interesting example. As I said, there's very few countries that actually have laws that allow street parking to be taxed. But one of those countries is Britain, and Nottingham, England, introduced this tax of now about €500 a year, introduced in 2017. And this tax applies only to workplaces, only to parking spaces available to employees, and only to employers that have more than 10 parking spaces. This graph basically shows the number of employee parking spaces available with those employers in Nottingham over time, and the black arrow in the middle shows the point at which the tax, called the workplace parking levy, the tax was introduced. And you can see that since the tax was introduced into 2017, then the number of parking spaces provided for staff fell. So there was a fall as companies prepared for the introduction of the charge of the tax. When the tax was introduced, the fall continued, and so from a number of around about 33,000 spaces, it fell to about 25,000 spaces over that period. And apologies, you might think doing this kind of thing would be economic suicide. The evaluation that's been carried out by Loughborough University, one of the nearby universities, they compared Nottingham's economic fortunes with the fortunes of comparable cities in the Midlands and north of England. And Nottingham has enjoyed higher than average growth, higher than average firm location, and also lower levels of congestion than those competitor cities since it introduced the workplace parking levy. The workplace parking levy was fundamental in Nottingham being able to secure sufficient central government money to build itself a tram network. And I think that is one of the key reasons why it's been successful, because it has a restraint measure, the workplace parking levy, but it has high quality public transport that is partly funded from the workplace parking levy. And that's kept employers and the population as a whole happy, because they see, okay, maybe we have to pay a bit more for parking, but we get good public transport in return. By the way, the 500 euros a year is paid by the employer. It's then the employer's decision as to whether to pass that on to the employee. Anecdotally, most have, but there's no official data on that. Another kind of strategic issue that's been important within the park for some projects that most of our cities are doing, if they can legally, is to recycle the revenues from parking into sustainable transport. So in Poland, this is really, really interesting. During the lifetime of the project, a new law was introduced in Poland where the biggest cities, 39 cities over 100,000 people, can they can basically declare a zone where all the parking fees from that zone, or most of them, have to be recycled into sustainable transport and green areas, so parks and things. 65% of income from fees and 100% of income from fines has to go into those things. So it can't go to the general city budget. And this has been used by a number of cities in Poland already. And then just a couple of other things. These aren't outputs from these aren't things that cities have done. These are just other outputs from the project, which I think are really useful. Genuinely, some excellent videos about parking. They're only short. They're only, they're mercifully short in a way, so you don't have to worry that you'll fall asleep while you're watching them. But they really do show how some small cities like Saint Nicolas in Belgium, some big cities like Sofia in Bulgaria, and some cities that have been active in parking management for a long time, like the Vitoria-Gasteiz in Ghent, what they've done to improve parking in their cities, and more importantly, to use parking in a strategic way to support their SUMP. So these are great videos. Even my son, my 11-year-old son, he agrees that they're excellent videos. And also, there's a really good brochure on arguments for parking management, because parking management is controversial. Many arguments put up to say why parking management shouldn't happen. What we try to do in this brochure is take those arguments against parking management and refute them with evidence and other arguments. And it presents other positive arguments for parking management as well. So you can find it along with lots of other outputs from Park at this URL here. It's available in various languages. That's Polish. I think there's a Slovenian version as well. So there we are. Thank you very much. Apologies for the technical pitches to start with, but thanks for listening. I hope you found that interesting. The key message is, parking, it's not just about where to park your car, it's about using parking as a strategic part of your sustainable urban mobility plan. Thanks.